Hello, my name's Roger Vinson, and I'm speaking to you today from the Camellia Garden at the University of West Florida. This Camellia Garden, as you can see, is a product of the University of West Florida, the Pensacola Camellia Club, and the University of West Florida's Retired Employees Association. It first came about in about 2007 when our Camellia Club was searching for a garden to plant the varieties of camellias that were originated by members of our Camellia Club. Since our Camellia Club was organized in 1937, we are probably the oldest Camellia Club still existent in the country, I know, and probably the oldest Camellia Club. Our Camellia Club was started in 1937, organized at the home of John Sherrill, looking out over Pensacola Bay. And it was the Men's Camellia Club at that time, and stayed the Men's Camellia Club for a number of years into the 1980s, I think. But the Camellia Garden itself became part of our project when we were looking for a home to plant the cultivars or varieties of camellias originated by members of our club over the years. And at the same time, the university was looking for something to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the founding of the university. All of this took place in 2007. And the Employees Association, Retired Employees Association, was looking for something to dedicate and give to the university in commemoration of that. And two of the leaders of our club, Ben Williamson and Gordon Eade, were also active members of the Employees Association, Retired Employees Association. So when we said we'd look for a garden, and they said, well, we would like to sponsor a garden, and the university's list of things they would like to have included a garden. So those three came into conjunction, and as a result, we started looking for some of our old camellias, and the great search for our old camellias even continues today. But we had located a number of them, and Ben Williamson and Gordon Eade led the search. And so it was that in 2007, we were able to begin the planting of this garden. I think we had only 28 varieties to plant in 2007, but we planted those, and very shortly thereafter we planted some others and dedicated the beginning of that garden in 2009 when we said we've got it planted out, and we had by that time almost 100 varieties planted here. You can see this plaque which commemorates Gordon Eade and Ben Williamson. And this recognizes our Camellia Garden as a member of the American Camellia Society's Camellia Trail. There are about 55 gardens recognized across the country from East Coast to West Coast as Camellia gardens within the Camellia Garden Trail. We're in very good company with almost all the well-known botanical gardens around the country that have camellias are a part of the Camellia Trail. Our garden was expanded by a sizable fundraising effort through our club and the Retired Employees Association 10 years later, in 2017. We put in the sidewalks, we put in benches, we put in lighting. The sprinkler system was completely revamped. The garden itself now has over 100 of the local originated camellias that we've been able to find out of approximately 125 that actually exist or existed and have been registered. And we've got a number of other different camellia varieties that are here that represent some of the nice varieties and some of the cultivars that have significance, and also some species, and I'll introduce some of those species as we walk around. But camellias in Pensacola have a long history, and in fact we didn't realize how far back our history went until we started doing some research. As far as we know, camellias first came to the United States in 1797. They were imported by Colonel Stevens in New Jersey, along with a shipment of other botanicals from England. And they had gotten to England before that, usually with shipments of tea plants. And I'll show you, this is a tea plant I'm standing right beside, in fact, Camellia sinensis. The tea is, in fact, a camellia. And as a part of their trade with China and Japan, the English imported a lot of plants that they thought were tea plants that turned out to be camellia plants, we think. But some of them were deliberately imported, and one of the plants that was brought in by Colonel Stevens was an Alba plena, which is still growing right here in Pensacola. It's one of our favorite white blooms and is very common. But eventually, camellias became to be expanded, and they were grown as hothouse plants in the United States. Everyone thought they were subtropical and needed to be protected all during the cold winter months. So they were grown in hothouses or greenhouses with heat. And probably the most important figure who propagated and sold camellias was a man by the name of William Prince, who had a nursery called the Linnaeus Botanical Garden in Long Island, right outside of New York City. Probably camellias came to all the seaport cities along the coast as a result of advertising and efforts made by William Prince in his nursery, because we found here in Pensacola, for example, an ad in the Pensacola Gazette from 1825. It's an ad by William Prince for his nursery, but included within that are ads for 28 what he calls Camellia japonicas, or the Japan rose. And probably one of those was the Alba plena variety that I just mentioned. We don't really know if Pensacolians bought some of those camellias in 1825. But of course, 1825, Pensacola was still sparsely populated, and Florida was sparsely populated. We'd only become a territory of the United States in 1821. By 1825, there was very little here except the seaport. But the seaport was very busy, we know that. And through the seaport, we think that there's a good possibility that camellias arrived that early, which would place camellias here even before they became planted in Charleston and some of the other places that we thought predated us by at least 25 or 50 years. We do know that camellias were growing here in Pensacola during the 1800s, probably before the Civil War. And camellias have always been a plant that were sort of a hobby of those who could afford to plant them. Men of wealth had camellias, and that was true in England, that was true in all the European countries. We know that in places in Portugal and Spain that I visited, the places that had camellias were the wealthy homes, the estates that had camellia gardens that they were able to plant. And that was also true in the United States, and that's probably why we had the Men's Camellia Club was originally formed all over the country after ours was started. And they were made up usually of some of the more wealthy members of the community who could afford the plants, because the cost of the plants at that time in today's dollars were $50 or even as much as $100 a plant. And very few could afford to have those plants and to grow them. We do know that after the Victorian age, camellias sort of fell out of favor. And particularly during the Depression, people could not really afford to have camellias. And there was a period of time when camellias sort of fell out of favor. But toward the end of the 1930s, and certainly by the time the Camellia Club was organized here in Pensacola in the late 1930s, 1937, camellias were becoming a very popular plant in the gardens of all people who had space and the money to afford them. So camellias then sort of exploded in terms of numbers in the 40s and 50s. And there was a time in Pensacola where we had camellias planted in everybody's backyard. And the show of the year for our Camellia Club, we would have more than 10,000 people visit our annual Camellia show, which was held usually down a Bayfront auditorium at the end of Halifax Street. Then camellias have again sort of fallen out of favor, but now they've resumed, and we see a lot of camellias here. And historically, camellias are ideally suited to this area of the country. There's a camellia crescent that runs down the Pacific coast, across the Gulf Coast, and up the southern Atlantic coast of the United States. And ideally, not only with the temperature, but also the rainfall and the acid soil and the sandy soil here in Pensacola make this an ideal place for camellias. And if you live in Pensacola, you probably should be growing camellias, not only because they're a pretty and evergreen plant, but also because they bloom in the wintertime. And you'll see some blooms in a few minutes that I'll be able to show you here in the Camellia Garden that are blooming even right now, almost on January 1st when I'm talking. They originated in China and Southeast Asia and some of the islands off of the coast of China and eventually up into Japan. There are so many different species. We have yet to find the limited number because we keep finding new species. We're finding species that are yellow. We found species that bloom all year long. We have species that we're able to crossbreed and get some of those characteristics, including the size of the camellias, into our current camellias. The most common one that we have in Pensacola is a hybrid between the Pensacola japonica, which is one of the two common varieties we have here. We have Camellia japonica and Camellia sasanqua, which are sasanquas bloom in the fall. Japonicas start blooming in December and bloom all the way until probably into April. But we found a species in the 1950s that was growing in China up in the mountains and had been carefully cultivated for thousands of years, at least over 1,000 years, by the monks in the monasteries, the Buddhist monks, and crossbred and cultivated so that they were much, much bigger than the typical camellia bloom. And we have some of those, and I'll show you at least one of those as we go on. Those cultivars of camellias were adopted by the Japanese. We and the Europeans think that camellias originated in Japan, and that's why our most common species of camellia is called the japonica, named after Japan. It was certainly grown by the Japanese, but probably the japonica originated in China. But the sasanqua originated, we think, in Japan or some of the Japanese controlled islands toward the Chinese coast. So what I'd like to do now is just walk around with you and show you some of the blooms that are going on right now here in our Camellia Garden, and that'll show you, I think, how important it is to have this garden and also how beautiful our camellias are. So I invite you to join me. All right, I'm standing in front of a Camellia sinensis, which is a tea plant, the most widely grown plant in the world. And you can see this one has a bloom on it. It's a white bloom, tiny bloom, and that's typical of all the tea plants. And they are grown predominantly in Southeast Asia, India, and China. But the tea plant is a member of the Camellia family. Camellia sinensis means essentially it's camellia from China. And the tea itself is picked from these tiny leaves. The Chinese laborers and you can see these 3 leaves right here are what they pick. They pick those tiny leaves, and they usually pick them every couple of weeks and make the tea. And the tea itself, the varieties of different kinds of teas, are the processing that change this into different teas, black ties, English teas, whatever kind of tea you want. But again, it's a very important member of the Camellia family, by far the most widely grown and the most widely known, but most people don't realize that tea is in fact a camellia, just like all of these other camellias around in the garden with the big beautiful blooms. This is a camellia. It's a species. It's like some of these other species beside me right here. And the species all have different kinds of blooms, but they're originated in the wild and haven't been cultivated and crossbred by the Chinese monks to develop the bigger blooms, which we talked about earlier. So this is the tea plant. All right, I'm standing beside another species, and the species that's grown directly in the wild and has been brought to this country. This one is Camellia vietnamensis, which by its name means it was found in Vietnam only within the last 30 or 40 years. And it has a pretty white bloom, a big white bloom, larger than almost all of the other camellias that grow out in the wild. But you can see it has a beautiful golden center and a big white span of white petals, and grows very rapidly. And even though it's from Vietnam, it's relatively cold hardy and stands our winters here in Pensacola quite well. So you can see our species come from all over most of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, China, Japan, and even into India, I think. So once again, another one of the species. This species is directly as it grows in the wild. It hasn't been hybridized or anything. Thank you. All right, I mentioned that the 2 common varieties or species of camellias grown in Pensacola are the Camellia japonica and the Camellia sasanqua. I'm standing in front of what we always call as a Camellia sasanqua. This one is called Yuletide, and it has a blooming season that spans Christmas. So that's why when it blooms on Christmas, and it's dependably blooming at Christmas time, as I'm speaking to you right after Christmas, and you can see it has a bright red series of petals with a golden center inside, beautiful blooms, and a great yard plant. The variety is Yuletide, a very common one here in Pensacola, and certainly one that's recommended for blooming at Christmas and Christmas decorations. All right, I'm standing in front of one of our originations from Pensacola Club members. This one is originated by Mr. Kahn and named after his son Dante. It's called Dante's Inferno, obviously because of the red color, bright red color, and it's blooming naturally here right after Christmas when I'm speaking to you, and you can see this plant is covered in red blooms. This form of petal is called a peony form. You can see it has multiple petals that are interspaced, unlike some of the others that are single blooms with just a single row of petals. Some of them have semi-double with 2 or more rows of petals that go around, and some of them are formal double petals that have actually no stamen at all. But you can see the stamen in here all intermixed with the petals, why this is called a peony form. And some of them are loose peony and some of them are tight peony, but this one is pretty typical of a peony form like that. You can see how tightly it is sometimes. but all sorts of different colors in camellias, as well as different forms of blooms and different blooming seasons. This blooming season right now is in December. It would be an early japonica. And again, this is a plant originated right here in Pensacola. All right, I'm standing in front of another Pensacola variety. This is Margaret Noonan, introduced by, I think it was Bill Noonan, and named for Margaret. And you can see it's blooming in full bloom here in December. Again, an early blooming japonica. And it has a beautiful pink with a rose, dark rose stripe down the center. And again is a peoniform camellia. And lots of buds, lots of blooms. And we're still in December, so it's blooming quite early without any gibberellic acid or anything. A camellia originated by a Pensacola Camellia Club member, one of over 100 we have here at the Camellia Garden. All right, I'm standing beside one of my favorite Pensacola varieties. This is Don Mac, originated by a family as a seedling, a chance seedling, out in their yard on 15th Avenue, and it was named after the neighbor who took it and planted it and grew the seedling. It's not in bloom yet because it's a mid-season bloomer and we're still in the early season, but in about a month or so it'll be in full bloom. You can see it's covered in buds, and it has a beautiful red and gold center, semi-double with a double row of red petals, sometimes even 3 rows of red petals. Don Mac, another Pensacola variety, and it's widely grown all over the world. I've seen Don Mac growing in gardens in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, even the furthest reaches of Australia and New Zealand. Don Mac is grown, originated right here in Pensacola. I mentioned to you that the most commonly grown camellias in Pensacola are japonicas and sasanquas, but this is a reticulata hybrid. It's bred with species reticulata, and you can see the reticulata blooms add a lot of size to the bloom. This particular bloom is over 6 inches across. As you can see, I'm holding it in my hand. It has been jibbed, or gibberellic acid has been applied to make it bloom a little early, and I'm speaking to you in December. And normally it would not be naturally blooming until probably late January, but these blooms have been jibbed, and you can see how big they are. But that's what hybridization does, and we have all sorts of hybrids that over the past 40 years or so we've developed. Some of them involve reticulatas, some of them are non-reticulata hybrids, and they have all different characteristics. And this one is a favorite of everyone who grows it. This is Frankhauser variegated because it's got some white in it. But you can see it's a beautifully formed bloom, and always is a winner at camellia shows, and grows well here in Pensacola. Even with our colder climates, reticulatas are a little bit more cold sensitive than japonicas, but this is an ideal plant to grow here in Pensacola if you want a nice big bloom like this. And you can see it consistently has big blooms, and they're always formed like this, and have a nice visible set of stamen in the center. Again, this is a reticulata hybrid camellia. Unlike the standard japonicas or reticulatas that have been grown for so many years, but more and more we are finding hybrids of reticulatas and other species hybridized with japonicas and other species to produce different colors, different blooming seasons, and adding more and more variety to the camellia family. This is Frankhauser variegated, and I'm standing right here in the corner of the Camellia Garden at University of West Florida, and it's striking as you drive up and see these big blooms right on the edge of the garden. So I want to thank you for watching. I appreciate the time that you've given, and come join us, come visit the garden. You'll find it a real treat to come see all the blooms here at the Camellia Garden at the University of West Florida. Again, it's a product of the cooperation of the Pensacola Camellia Club, the University of West Florida Retired Employees Association, and the University of West Florida. So, thank you.